This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, there we go. So that will obviously be uploaded for you to be able to review and potentially circulate to colleagues, fellow councillors, if you're a councillor. Bearing in mind we are a mixed group this afternoon, a mix of councillors and officers, and hopefully what we will be talking through will have equal salience to both groups. But yeah, so I'm just going to briefly share my screen just to go through with you what the agenda is going to be this afternoon. So we're going to start off with 5-10 minutes or so just to kind of reflect on the objectives of the session. We're going to then hear from Guy, then we're going to have some Q&A for Guy, and then we're going to have some small group working on just to sort of share your thoughts and reflections on your current activity in respect of budget scrutiny particularly. And then at 2, we're going to have some feedback from that session. And then the last 20 minutes or so, I'm going to quickly run through some thoughts and reflections for you on in-year financial scrutiny. So that's reviewing the ongoing delivery of services against the budget, just for sort of 20-25 minutes at the end. So it's going to be sort of, a straightforward but busy hour and a half. And I'd like to sort of start us off, if I may, by asking, we do have a lot of people on the call, but I do want to have the opportunity to have a look and understand what your objectives are for the session so that we can make sure that we can meet them. So if I could ask you just to write in the meeting chat, assuming that you have access to the meeting chat, just to introduce yourself and also just to briefly outline what you consider your objectives would be for the next 90 minutes or so, what you're most hoping to get out of this session. And I, primarily as Guy is speaking, can review that and make sure that I'm bearing that in mind. So, for example, if you have particular questions that you might want to address at this stage, that may well be the way and place to do it. So if I can ask you to start doing that now, I'll just stop sharing my screen. And hopefully those will start coming in. And as they do, I will give Guy a sort of proper introduction. So Guy, well, hopefully will need no introduction for many of you. He's the Director of Local Government Value for Money at the audit firm Grant Thornton. He previously sort of was led on Grant Thornton's local government advisory work and has recently moved over to VFM, but is somebody that we've worked with along with other Grant Thornton colleagues for many years, and is engaged with the work of us with your work as scrutineers as well. He has been involved in providing support and advice and guidance and audit services to sort of councils obviously across England, but alongside other colleagues at GT has also been involved in the work to prepare what are called public interest reports. So under certain circumstances, Guy will go into this, the auditor is under an obligation to produce a sort of report in the public interest outlining concerns or issues relating to the council's financial position. That's a duty that falls to the external auditor, and obviously GT have recently produced a piece of research which goes into a bit more depth on recent public interest reports and draws out common themes in areas of learning, and that is one of the issues that Guy is going to talk about. I will post a link in the chat to where you can download that report. It's a really, really good read. It's not massively long, and it repays the read, definitely. So I very much encourage you to review that when you have the opportunity. So I can see plenty of people saying things in the chat, and I will have an opportunity to look through those in a moment as we go on. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Guy to introduce himself, and we're going to put up the his presentation in a moment as well, and we'll get going. So Guy, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the intro, Ed, and thank you for the invitation to participate in the webinar. Yeah, so I'm at Grant. I've been at Grant Thornton for about 20 years, working in various roles here, as Ed says, all working and focusing on the local government sector. Prior to that, I had 11 years in operational roles in the local government sector. I started out as a CIPFA trainee, so I'm a member of and fellow of CIPFA as a body, as an institute. So if we can move to the first slide, please. And good afternoon, everybody. So I just thought I'd give a bit of background on the role of external auditors, just in case there's any on the call that aren't on the same page. So under the 2014 Act, the NAO has set out a code for the audit work of local auditors for local public bodies. In effect, that covers the work that we do on both the audit on the financial statements and the value for money work. Of note, the code gets reviewed and typically refreshed on a 5-year cycle and approved on that 5-year cycle by Parliament. The code was updated from the 1st of April last year, so we're currently in 21-22, which is year 2 of the new code. And it's worth noting because value for money as a scope of work became more significantly expanded and in depth than in the immediate prior code. It's more like the value for money work under code of about 10 years ago. But what that means for things like statutory recommendations and public interest reports is that there is a greater level of value for money work which may identify issues and weaknesses that lead to things like statutory recommendations. So auditors have various powers. Ed mentioned public interest reports. There is also statutory recommendations which councils need to where they're issued. Councils need to respond to them publicly, and so that typically means a discussion at full council meeting. And the reason I put those in is that the lessons learned reports that we've done, the national thematic papers, are largely drawn on public interest reports and statutory recommendations. Some other interventions, such as Section 114s, have been included. It's worth noting that the paper that Ed is going to send the link to is not just those interventions from Grant Thornton. It's from various audit firms and indeed Audit Wales, because there's a couple of PIRs in recent months, or in the last 12 months, from Welsh local government. So we are the largest auditor, so we do feature fairly strongly. But the paper, and it is worth a read, is about themes. So we don't draw out case studies of individual councils, although at the end of the paper we list those that form the scope of the themes. Public interest reports traditionally have been incredibly rare. There hadn't been one for about 20 years, and then in the space of 6 months through to January 21, there were 3. And that led us to do our first lessons learned paper that we published in March 2021. At the time, we thought that was probably the only lessons learned paper we were going to do, but further statutory recommendations, further PRs and other interventions happened a lot more over the following year or so. And the link that Ed is going to send you is our second lessons learned paper, which we published in September this year. If you could move to the next slide, please. And the next slide summarises the key themes from that second paper, the one that came out in September this year, across 5 broad thematics. If you were to root cause all of these, the parent theme is the theme that's number 1 there. So when you root cause, typically you find that it's leadership and culture that it is the heart of the problems. And part of what both reports identified as a theme was where it goes badly wrong. There's a culture of denial. There is institutional or willful blindness. There is a lack of making U-turns when something is clearly gone wrong. There is a culture of secrecy. There is a culture of lack of transparency and engagement with key decision makers and key officers. And this isn't necessarily just about elected members. It can indeed be elected members, but equally it can be senior officers not engaging elected members in a timely way, or not engaging them fully within a key decision-making process. So that was the sort of the parent theme, if you like. The context, obviously, to all of this is that local government as a sector has had, 10 years of austerity, has had Brexit, has had a global pandemic, and we've now got a cost of living crisis, and included within that an energy and inflation crisis. So there has been significant challenges and externalities impacting on local government, of course, over many years. Many in the sector responded to austerity by changing their risk appetite and looking to take more innovative approaches to things like commercial decisions. That included setting up local authority trading companies where they were subsidiary to a local council, and that's where this second thematic comes in. So where it's gone badly wrong, there has been, for example, a lack of an appropriate business case. There's been a lack of appropriate expertise to scrutinise the business case and to scrutinise the company once it's operational. There's been a lack of expertise in those who've been given roles, but either operational or director level on companies. So what we find is that where it's gone wrong, the due diligence hasn't taken place up front, and that's set many challenges for the operations of the company, and it's fallen over. This is I'll say one bit of case law now. It's not specific to the last 12 months, but it's Burgoyne and Cook, and it is worth noting because this was where two senior officers of a London borough were appointed as directors for a leisure company, a spin-off leisure company. The leisure company did not meet its financial targets, but it kept trading, and the two directors failed to respond to their fiduciary duty. So within all of this, there's a lack of understanding of company law, where it goes wrong. They continued trading because it was delivering a service that the council wanted. They didn't meet their fiduciary duty. The administrators came in. There was £1 million of losses. They were held jointly and severally liable for those losses. They went to their employer council and said, we're indemnified. And the council said yes. And they went to the insurers and they said, no, you're indemnified for your council role, but not your role as company directors. A very unpleasant experience for them both. That's theme 2. Theme 3 is where there has been some significant weaknesses and failings. There has been long-standing, challenging relationships between senior officers and senior members, and the inability. So this is where standards are not being met. The codes of conduct for both members and officers are not being adhered to. Things like whistleblowers are not being respected and properly supported or ignored. And so that is something that is another theme that's come out of the more recent interventions that we've looked at. Number 4, like many back office services over the period of austerity, the finance function has lost people, has lost roles, has lost resources, and has lost some corporate memory. And not all councils that have reduced their headcount in the finance function have had significant failures, but it is a theme for many where things have gone wrong. So this means that there isn't effective skills and experience, particularly where we're talking about new sort of innovative commercial decisions that the council is being made. So there's a lack of understanding of some of these innovations. Also, as a sort of as a proxy measure, there's been a significant increase in the ability of some councils to issue their draft accounts to their auditors on time. And finally, theme 5. Again, in a number of cases where where there's been interventions, the audit committee has been ineffective. So there's been a lack of appropriate chairing, a lack of appropriate conducting of business in a professional way, a lack of effective scrutiny. One stat actually going back to the officers and members, another sort of symptom of where there is problems is the use of external legal advice, and whether that's on the removal of a senior officer or on another area. And in some cases, we find different officers going to different legal firms to buy an external legal advice to use within the issues that relate to poor relationships between officers and members. One council spent close to £1 million on legal fees that related to the removal of a single senior officer. Excuse me. Moving on to the next slide, please. So the next two slides. Before we get on to that slide, these are some quotes. So these are largely from public interest reports. I'm not going to go. This is the only slide where individual councils are named, but it just supports some of the themes that I've been referring to already. So Slough, there's no evidence the council properly understood the risks involved in running down reserves. Nottingham, this was a trading company, so the council was determined that the company should be a success, and this led to institutional blindness. That's an example of institutional blindness. Sandwell is an example where there was a breakdown in relationships between senior officers and senior members. Croydon, this one also related to, in part, to a local office trading company, but legal advice was obtained, but it was not fully considered. And finally, Copeland, there was no budget monitoring in place at all for that particular financial year. Some of these are quite extraordinary. If we can move on, please, Ed. So the next two slides are taken from our September report. They set out our view on practical steps to safeguard your organisation based on the lessons, the thematic lessons that we identified in that report. So regular reviews of governance policies that sit within the council's constitution is something that all councils should be doing, as should be code of conduct training for members and for officers. Actually, one of the bodies that sort of featured within the paper has subsequently brought in external support. I think that may include CfGS to provide training to both members and officers on their roles and how they can look at improving their working relationship. Training is a theme here, so training on external companies where that is an issue to make sure that members and officers are fully aware of their roles and the legal frameworks that sit around such companies. Undertaking a skills audit where members and officers are directed companies to feed in to that training. Having explicit shareholder agreements. So where a council has set up an arm's length company, typically the council is the sole shareholder of that company, and ensuring that the shareholder agreements between the council and the company are in place and appropriate. Complaints, whether that's by members of the public on members, members against members, or officers against members. If there's a high number of complaints that are not being resolved, that is often a proxy indicator of a cultural challenge within the organisation. So again, reviewing those transparently and coming to a resolution is going to be important. Moving on to the next slide, please. Succession planning is a challenge across many roles within local government at the moment. This one here relates to the theme we identified in the finance function, but equally this could be across many other roles, including, for example, chairs of key committees and bodies such as scrutiny boards. Considering SIP for Financial Management Code, so this was brought in as mandatory a couple of years ago. It's clear that there is a variation across the sector on how councils are considering whether they meet the code and whether they're doing self-assessments. So undertaking a self-assessment against that code is good practice. Training for audit committee members, and again, that given the audience here, that could also be scrutiny members, and having action plans for audit committee recommendations. So again, a theme was where things don't go well, audit committees are not keeping track on the action plans from the internal audit reports that go to audit committee to monitor that the recommendations have actually been actioned and progressed. And finally, where things go wrong, and I talked earlier about sort of secrecy and a lack of transparency, there's also potentially a bullying culture and a lack of challenge because of that. So challenge and debate is important, and part of that is seeing internal external audit as critical friends. So that's the final practical step. I'm now going to sort of talk a bit more about financial scrutiny. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So I mentioned the SIP from a financial management code, and I've put in quite a detailed couple of quotes here, and I think it's important because the Section 151 officer is not the sole person responsible for the financial management of a local authority, and that's made explicit within the SIPFA FM code. The code talks about the council leadership team being responsible for financial management and financial sustainability of the council, and that includes, as well as the 151, it's the executive, it's portfolio holders, and it is key committees as well as senior officers. It also makes the point that this is cultural, so it's about actions and behaviours as well as having processes and systems in place. And again, that's both from officers and elected members. And it supports the earlier point that we make in our lessons learned report, that a culture of constructive challenge is something that remains critical for effective financial management. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. I was looking for a definition of scrutiny, and I picked this one because it's from a few years ago now, raising the stakes. But I picked it because it's a report that was jointly produced by CfGS, as was, and Grant Thornton. So scrutiny is the power to get information, question the executive councillors, officers, and certain other organisations, and make recommendations, and importantly, get responses. I thought that was a useful definition to throw into the mix. If we can move to the next slide. So clearly, where things go wrong, there is a lack of potential clarity on roles and responsibilities, or indeed individuals not fulfilling their particular roles and responsibilities. And in terms of finance, I've put what's hopefully a useful summary here. So full council agrees the policy and the budgetary framework. The strategies that sit below that, including the MTFP and the budget, are proposed by Cabinet. The corporate management team, so that's the senior officers, are charged with the operational delivery of that and monitoring performance. And then scrutiny councillors, their role includes assisting Cabinet in developing properly costed budget proposals, monitoring the performance, scrutinising of decisions and policies, ensuring there is accountability in place, and also, where you have significant external providers, scrutinising their performance as well. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So factors for effective scrutiny. Forward planning is really, really important. So and this goes hand in hand with effective relationships between scrutiny councillors, between the various chairs and vice chairs, between chairs of like the audit committee, portfolio holders and Cabinet, and making sure that you have clarity, for example, on the executive's forward plan. And hopefully that forward plan isn't just a month or a quarter, it's a bit more long term, so that scrutiny can effectively manage its work programme, its research, its agenda items over the municipal year. I hadn't realised this was going to be one of those ones that's individual bullets, so we'll go with it. I've covered both those together. The next thing is that you will have a broad spectrum of skills and experience across an elected member membership. So make sure that skills and experience is appropriately deployed in scrutiny. So making sure that chair and vice chair are appropriately skilled, and indeed other members of scrutiny, and as I've already mentioned, have a robust training and development programme to support those scrutiny members. The next bullet, please, is training and support. And the next bullet. Yeah, I mean, scrutiny members, you know, like any profession or any industry or sector, there is all manner of technical jargon, acronyms, and that's the case in local government finance. So there are different types of approaches to financial planning, from zero-based budgeting, outcomes-based budgeting, priority-based budgeting, incremental budgeting, sort of understanding those options and which one is being used by your local authority is going to be important, as is the approach to financial management and budgetary control. So what's being used and what are the alternative options that might be available to you as an organisation. And if we could move to the next bullet, please. Now, this is a really key one. You know, scrutiny is about knowing what questions to ask, and I think where it doesn't work effectively, we see that the right questions are not being asked. Now, I think that may be the final bullet, but if you could just check. So here's some examples of the sorts of questions that people in scrutiny roles may want to ask. So, you know, where did the risks sit? Where are the highest strategic risks? Are there any new risks? Has that led to a change in our strategic objectives? And are our resources, both revenue and capital, aligned to those strategic objectives? Does the medium-term financial plan consider scenario planning? You know, worst, best, optimum scenario. Is there sensitivity analysis and benchmarking analysis that sit below the plan to give you confidence in the assumptions that make up the plan, and are outcome measures being considered? Where services are demand-driven, such as areas such as children's and adult social care or homelessness, have you assurances that future demand patterns are effectively understood and modelled? What changes are happening in the external environment that will have an impact on resource requirements? Obviously, I've already alluded to the fact that over the last 10 or so years, there's been an inordinate amount of externalities impacting on local government finances, and that continues to be the case for the foreseeable future. Have you got assurances that your savings plan to meet the inevitable gap in your medium-term financial plan is achievable? Is there any optimism bias in that savings plan? Where it goes wrong, we often identify optimism bias. And how does the council pay for borrowing? In one of the recent interventions, there was debt of £750 million, and there was only £40,000 of minimum revenue provision within this year's budget. So, and if you're not familiar with MRP, all I'll say is that is staggeringly insufficient. And so when that was identified, it created an even larger funding hole within the medium-term financial plan. And then moving on to the next slide, which is some further questions. Ultimately, it's the 151's responsibility to recommend to council the sustainable level of reserves. But scrutiny has a role to assess that. Are they sustainable, or are they being depleted? You know, reserves can only be used once. Are they being used to plug that medium-term financial gap and leading to financial sustainability challenges across the medium to longer term? Are income projections realistic? Obviously, we've been through a global pandemic, and many fees and charges and commercial rents and commercial income remain impacted by the legacy of COVID-19. Has income projections within the budget been effectively adjusted to take account of that, as an example? Are there alternative ways of delivery that haven't been considered? So, you know, many councils have considered not just trading companies, but things like shared services, joint ventures, and other forms of delivery. And are there any new ways of generating income? So they're just some of the questions that we believe scrutiny should be asking of the budget, of the financial planning, and finally, recognising that those charged with scrutiny may not have all the expertise. Are you clear when you need to call on support to help you in your role? A sort of final key question that you need to know when to ask. How are we doing for time, Ed? Nearly there on the slides. Yeah. So some final key considerations. So is the overall financial planning approach appropriate to the council's circumstances? I mentioned there's most councils probably still use incremental budgeting, but is that appropriate? Or indeed, if you're using something like zero-based budgeting, is that appropriate, or is there another type of financial planning approach that could be more appropriate for the council's circumstances? What's the rationale for major savings and growth proposals? Really, really important, and it plays to that optimum bias point I've already made. And what will the service impact be of those savings, and has that been fully understood and thought through? Now, councils and those with making key decisions at the moment have got an immensely unenviable task, you know, at a time when the communities that you serve are going to be looking for reductions in fees and charges and council tax and increases in service provision. You know, austerity Mark II, or what we're anticipating from later this week, means that councils can be looking to be doing the reverse of that. But understanding the impact of any decision is going to be important, including those that are made for financial reasons. You'll be surprised how many times that we identify that the budget that a council doesn't align to the corporate plan and priorities. In some cases, that's because the corporate plan it doesn't really have any measurable indicators that sit against it, so it's hard to align resource to the corporate plan. But it is a question that is definitely worth considering. And underpinning all of the budget is going to be a myriad, you would hope, of different assumptions. So what is the scenarios that are being considered? What is the sensitivities that are being considered that underpin those assumptions for you to gain assurances that they are appropriate? And again, this is just re-emphasising an earlier point. You know, is the reserves policy appropriate for the financial circumstances the council finds itself? Moving on to the next slide, please. So this is my final slide. It looks like it's a build one, Ed. So if you can click the button again, thank you. So just in summary, effective scrutiny is always going to be important, including during a financial planning and indeed financial monitoring. I would suggest that it's even more critical now, given current and future financial conditions that all councils will be finding themselves in. I'm not going to repeat what's on the right, but there's some key questions for you to consider. And the final part of the slide, it's a few years old now, but Max Caller, who's done a number of inspections, this is from the Northamptonshire County Council inspection. I do think it's a good one. In local government, there's no substitute for doing boring really well. Only when you have a solid foundation can you innovate. And it's fair to say, where things have gone badly wrong, boring hasn't been done well. Okay, so that's my final slide. I think hopefully that's about the 20 minutes, and we're now over to questions.
Thanks, Guy. That was great. And there are a couple of questions arising from stuff in the chat that I wanted to pick up first. Okay. And if anybody else has got any questions, obviously there are loads of people on the call, so I can't sort of guarantee that any and all questions will be answered, but we will be obviously downloading the chat and we'll be trying to deal with any questions that come up. But the first one I wanted to address to you guys just come up in the chat, actually. I think it's a really, really good one that engages with the issue about you know, the optimism bias that you touched on. And this is from Layla, who is a Croydon councillor, and I note that there are a few Croydon colleagues on the call this afternoon. Welcome to you all. And she asks, the issues of scrutineer is when senior executive officers tell you that modelling or estimating projections have been done well and explain in detail why they've been done well, but it still ends up being wrong and income targets don't get met. How do you mitigate that optimism bias, scrutineers? And if I can add as an adjunct to that, under those circumstances, I find that generally exec people, Section 151's cabinet members will not accept that they have an optimism bias. They will say, "Oh no, we're being very realistic. We're being conservative, small c, about our approach here. We think this is realistic." Blah blah blah. But how do you dig into that? How do you get beyond that initial response, Guy?
If I've understood the question correctly, and do please tell me if I'm going down the wrong avenue. But I do think financial benchmarking is really, really important to get an understanding of how, Council X compares to its statistical nearest neighbours. So if you just take unit costs as one example, understanding why unit costs you may be high for your nearest neighbour group. Understanding why that is really important. It may be because it's difference in policy prioritisation between bodies, but it also may be because there are inefficiencies or another group of councils is doing something differently and better. So I think where things go wrong, that we often see an insularity. It's sort of the insularity and the optimum bias and the willful blindness can be sort of interrelated themes. So looking outwards, seeing what other organisations are doing, getting that benchmarking check can be a way of managing the optimism bias.
Thanks, Guy. And just to add to that, for colleagues' benefit, obviously a lot of that nearest neighbour work is done by CIPFA. CIPFA have a large data and analytics team who do a lot of number crunching to identify where councils sit in comparison to their neighbours. So I would encourage you to engage with that data where it's available to you. That data probably won't be available to you just sort of on the internet randomly. You will have to access it through the authority and probably through the Section 151. Sorry, Guy, did you want to?
So a lot of the data is as you say, but CIPFA have a financial resilience index.
They do, yeah.
Which is publicly available to anybody. It's quite easy to use, as with all data. The challenge is in the interpretation, but the index as a tool is easy to use. And I should say as well that your auditors will be looking at this. So whether that's Grant Thornton or another audit firm, and so there should be content in your annual audit reports, which are the value for money, the new value for money reports on this. So that's a useful external check on your financial benchmarking as well.
Thanks, Guy. Another thing coming in, and this is sort of out of thing that Robert Ward has just put in the chat, but it also derives from one of the objectives that a couple of people put in further up. This issue really about how you get around issues where the Section 151 cabinet members, other officers may be resistant or defensive about engaging constructively with scrutiny, and this sort of issue about what do we do when you've got concerns about how the executive is engaging, when you've got concerns about the budget, where sometimes those concerns might be quite inchoate in nature because you don't necessarily have the evidence to say, look, there's a red flag over here that indicates clearly this thing is going on. It's often more of a vibe than anything else. When you've got that sort of concern, that worry that things perhaps aren't being done right, but you've not necessarily got the evidence information to support that conclusion. How you read between the lines, how you try and unpick those issues and disprove or prove the hypothesis that things aren't necessarily going right as non-finance professionals.
Yeah, I mean, there's a phrase that auditors have called auditor's nose, which only comes from experience, and I guess we're talking about a scrutineer's nose, aren't we? And that will come from experience, and it plays to one of the report's findings, which is about having, deploying the skills appropriately that you have. So experience is the way that you may identify something is perhaps not right. The question then is, how do you go about it? So if with my auditor's nose, I think something is not quite right, then I will seek to find evidence to support and validate that hypothesis. Now, auditors, of course, have powers. We can go in and insist ultimately to beat an individual or access documents. Those powers may not exist, of course, with members of the scrutiny board. Now, each council's constitutional arrangements, the terms of reference of these bodies may differ. But first, I would look to see what constitutionally, somebody in a scrutiny role can access. Because my view is that if you're in a role for scrutiny, you should be able to access the documents that you are requesting. It also plays the point around knowing when to bring in support and guidance. So that could be, from within the council, it could be from the monitoring officer, from democratic services, it could be externally. Some scrutiny functions have budgets where they can commission work. And again, that's a potential option, buying in, some research to try and evidence the scrutineer's nose.
Thanks, Guy. I was just wondering, in your view, one thing that we often don't talk about very much is the sort of wider public sort of audit kind of role, because obviously members of the public have the right to inspect the council's accounts, and you'll often find in some areas community activists and others who've got a particular interest in trying to engage these kinds of issues who don't often have any sort of formal way into the process. Wondering whether you think that they potentially have a role to feed into the scrutiny process.
It's a good question. I mean, back in my very early days of my career, I was responsible for responding to public requests for the accounts, and I think I was working for a medium-sized London borough at the time. Probably 4 or 5 requests a year used to come in. So maybe so say armchair auditors have increased over the intervening period. But absolutely, I think scrutiny, part of a scrutiny role is to be clear about how they engage different groups. That can include external groupings, it can include external individuals such as armchair auditors. There is no necessarily right or wrong answer, I don't think, but being clear about the individuals or the organisations, both internally and externally, that you need to engage with is clearly an important point.
Thanks, Guy. And I'm really conscious of time, but I did want to ask one final question coming in from the chat, which is about alignment between scrutiny and the audit committee. And this is something which I'll touch on when I do my bit in a moment. But your thoughts, Guy, on the links between scrutiny, the scrutiny committee or committees, and the council's audit committee?
Yeah, really important. In communication, sharing forward plans, having effective pre-meetings, how you engage with the executive, with audit committee, with scrutiny committee, and between those bodies is really important. So, being, both those bodies are apolitical, aren't they? So there should be sort of regular dialogue between chairs and vice chairs across all key committees to make sure that you're clear about your own forward plans.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Guy. And I know that there are a couple of sort of questions that is in the chat that haven't been answered. I'm afraid we've got to move on for reasons of time, but I will make sure that we pick those up, that we direct them towards either myself or Guy separately, and we get you a substantive response to those questions if they exist. But thank you, Guy, very much for that and for your contribution. I don't know if you can hang around for the next part or whether you've got to shoot off, but thanks very much for your contribution thus far. Really appreciate it, and really interesting sort of setting out of things. What I would direct colleagues towards is a couple of things that we've produced on this topic in the last couple of years. We produced a financial scrutiny practice guide, a couple of years back, which sort of digs into some of these issues in a bit more detail. And I would encourage you to look at that. We also produced we've also produced a couple of things on scrutiny's role in and around risk and resilience, particularly in relation to council's engagement in commercial activity, in which you might be interested, and also scrutiny's work with audit as well. So there are a range of pieces of material that we've produced on finance scrutiny, budget scrutiny. We will, after the event, when we're circulating the recording to you, include links to all of those publications so that you can review them. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into a sort of short, sort of small group working session. And what I'm going to ask Meg to do is to divide you up into groups of 5 or so, to have about 15 minutes or so in a group of 5 or 6 people, sharing your reflections. Well, firstly, I suppose, on what you've heard. Secondly, on your current experiences and expectations around budget scrutiny as you're doing it. So, you know, this is about your you know, the approach you're taking at the moment towards budget scrutiny, what you're doing, what you're planning. It may have begun for you, it may be about to begin. Some of the experiences that you've had trying to work with officers and members to try and make it happen, some of the successes that you've had this year and in previous years, some of the difficulties that you've had, and hopefully through some of those conversations, you know, you can identify possible approaches that others are taking that might work well for you, or you can have a, you know, sort of collective kind of a bit of sort of collective therapy about some of the experiences that you've had, if those might be rather negative. And hopefully, because people are coming from different backgrounds and environments on this, we can have some interesting discussions. So if we can do that, Meg, and if I can ask you to sort of set people up in groups of 5 or 6, we'll have 15 minutes or so for conversation, then we'll come back into plenary, where I will ask you to write down your thoughts in the chat. Don't write anything down in the chat in the group itself, because generally speaking, we find that content tends to get lost. Wait until we get back into plenary, and I will prompt you to do it then. So if we can do that now, and hopefully. We'll see you all in a minute.
This meeting is being recorded.
Meg, can you make me a co-host so that I can flitter around between the rooms?
Yep. Just give me a sec. There you go.
All right, smashing, thanks. Will you be able to kind of wait outside here?
Yeah.
In case anybody kind of, yeah, that would be great.
Cheers.
going to get them back in a few minutes, a couple of minutes.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so I think everybody is either back or on their way back in. Can I ask, in terms of sharing reflections and thoughts on what you've heard in that session, I was only able to get around a few of the rooms because there were 12 or 13 rooms in total. So, you know, time was against me. But if I could ask you to put down in the chat your thoughts on it, but don't press enter until I say so. If you just sort of write your thoughts and refrain from putting them in the chat until I say, and everybody will press enter at the same point, and that all the comments will come in together at the same time. As you're doing that, just take the opportunity, as to use the privilege as host to summarize some of my reflections on what I heard in the few groups that I was part of. I think one thing that people were sort of concerned about was timescales and the difficulty, I suppose, at the moment, given the inherent uncertainty about local authority finances, to be involved early enough in the process. Hearing from a few people actually that expectations had shifted back in terms of timing, where you would normally expect the budget scrutiny process to begin earlier on in the year, that having had to be shifted back by a month or 2 months, even in some cases, and that's a real worry, because it limits scrutiny's effectiveness. Although I understand the reasons from a corporate perspective why you might want to do that. Another thing about members' skills to be able to scrutinise effectively. I think we often talk about member training as being a bit of a panacea for this kind of thing. And I think member training is part of, improving stuff in this area, but is only a part of the picture. So I think member training is important. I think officer training, in getting finance professionals and other senior officers to understand what scrutiny is trying to do here, is important. I often find myself in situations where I'm speaking to groups of middle managers, and I'm surprised often by the extent to which middle managers frequently have very, very little understanding of the member role, and particularly of issues around what budget scrutiny is meant to be doing. So while member development is important, officer development is too. I think sort of ensuring that the focus of scrutiny is on strategic matters. So a lot of the things that Guy suggested, so the questions that Guy posed as being the kinds of things that would need to be asked, were quite strategic in nature. And I do personally think that that's probably where the greatest benefit of scrutiny is going to lie in, asking those questions that sort of that probe into the fundamentals that sit behind the budget, that interrogate the assumptions sitting behind the budget, rather than just going through a spreadsheet line by line. You've got to temper that, though, because I think there is a need for some of that forensic line by line scrutiny. I would dislike the idea of just casting that out entirely, but it's very, very difficult getting the balance right between the two things. And I think, you know, if you look at the way that much budget scrutiny is done, where maybe this time of year or in December, you know, a 600-page agenda goes out with, you know, close 10-point sort of close tight spreadsheets full of, you know, numbers, does not feel to me to be a particularly effective way of doing things. There's another thing that came up for me around political independence and the need for budget scrutiny to be, you know, to be seen as independent as being an important part of the political structure of the authority, but not influenced too much by party political issues that I heard people talking about around chairs who are members of the majority party trying to limit and nobble the effectiveness of budget scrutiny, which obviously is a really big concern, and it speaks to political culture in some authorities. And I'm sure that's an experience that some of you would have heard as well. So could I ask that you press return on your comments in the chat now, and I will see what else comes in. I'll just give us all just a couple of moments just to kind of look at these. What I should say again is that we, Meg and I, will be looking in detail at everything that's coming in on the chat, and we'll be producing a note that reflects on and engages with all of these issues. So even if you've put stuff in there that I'm not directly addressing now, it will be in a note which will be published afterwards. Yeah, other timescale issues coming through here as well. Transparency of spending, you know, skills, availability of information leading to delay is definitely something that I recognise as well. You know, information access for scrutineers it continues to be an enormous bugbear for me. The difficulty that councillors and officers, scrutiny officers, find in just getting hold of basic information to support the scrutiny role. You know, there's no excuse for it really. And again, you know, we've tried to you know, produce stuff to highlight members' information access rights, but it's slow work. So confidence in asking the right questions regardless of financial expertise. Yeah, what I should say is that you shouldn't expect that you'll be able to go toe-to-toe with the Section 151 officer on the subject of finance. That's not what the scrutiny role is. You don't need to be financial professionals. What you need to do is ask questions that derive from the unique perspective and role that scrutiny has, which is the role of the elected member. So questions that arise from your understanding of the local community, what the local community wants and needs, which is arguably an insight, a set of perspectives that senior officers will not necessarily have. I mean, they will to an extent, but not to the degree that councillors will have. So using that to dig into, to question assumptions, the kinds of things that we've talked about as well. Other things about things being late in the day, information access. Yeah. So I'm sure there are things there that I've missed. And if so, we will pick those up afterwards. And again, you know, you'll appreciate that, you know, the number of people on the call means that inevitably I'm not able to pick up anything and everything. So apologies for that. For the last 15 minutes or so, I'm just going to briefly run you through some issues about in-year budget and finance monitoring, because that's the other side of the picture really. And you know, when we talk about finance scrutiny, budget scrutiny is one important element of it, but another one is the role of scrutiny throughout the year in keeping updated on financial performance generally. So I'll just share my screen with you again and run through just 3 or 4 slides for you on this subject. So in-year monitoring of financial issues. So scrutiny does have a really, really important role here. And we talked briefly a few minutes ago about the scrutiny role and the audit role. And I think this is one where there's a joint, you know, joint responsibility around in-year monitoring of financial matters as well. So I don't think that in-year monitoring of financial issues looks like, for scrutiny certainly, bringing detailed financial information like outturns, some monthly monitoring reports to scrutiny meetings for review separately. You know, that process, that will be happening in the audit committee, or should be happening in the audit committee, so it will duplicate and be, it's not massively useful to get that information presented context free in scrutiny. It's more about using that information to make judgments about where pressures on finances currently lie. So it's using that information to identify, where are overspends emerging, where are underspends emerging, where are risks emerging around demand that may place the budget under pressure. So when this information is being produced, as it will be on a regular basis, and some of that will be monthly, some of that will be quarterly, outside committee, those of you who are councillors, being able to access that information, look at it and say, where are there issues here that suggest that we might want to draw this matter out and bring it to committee to have a separate, more detailed discussion about it. And that will be connected to risk issues as well. So it'll be connected to performance matters too. So when I talk about these things, if you've heard me talk about this kind of stuff before, then you'll be familiar with me banging on about the link between performance, finance and risk information. And the three things are inextricably combined, and together they will provide you with a really, really good running sense of how the council is performing month by month, quarter by quarter. Looking at performance, finance and risk information together gives you really, really useful insights into what matters you might need to bring to scrutiny committee to talk about in more detail. And that really is the power and strength of review of in-year financial monitoring information, is using it alongside that other data to influence and inform what you bring to committee. So this is, in terms of finance, this is really all about the council's confidence in its ability to be able to deliver a balanced budget, because you'll be aware that if at any point the Section 151 officer is concerned or has serious doubt or considers that it will not be possible for the authority to deliver a balanced budget, they're under an obligation to produce what's known as a Section 114 notice, which once laid gives the Section 151 officer the obligation to reduce council expenditures to ensure that a balanced budget can be delivered, because obviously delivering a balanced budget is a formal legal obligation for the authority. Now, Section 114s used to be vanishingly rare. They were not things that used to happen. If you look back, beyond 4 or 5 years ago, they were, you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of them that had been in the previous kind of 20 years or so. Now, in the last few years, that's been very, very different. And there are certainly estimates that there are, authorities teetering on the edge of Section 114s being issued that number in the high teens at the moment, if not higher, to be honest. So scrutiny being able to talk about and interrogate this issue about the council's ability to be able to deliver a balanced budget as a part of its regular ongoing work is, I think, really important, because it gets to the heart really of these kinds of issues. And if you're starting to see odd and unexpected overspends and underspends and violence between different budgets, that in itself starts to look a little bit like a warning sign that things may not be going as you would expect. So as I said, there is this link between scrutiny and audit. Audit has this kind of key set of regulatory responsibilities around finance, has a set of broader duties around value for money as well. So scrutiny has to think about the work that it does in relation to in-year financial monitoring that doesn't cut across the work that audit does, but instead complements it. So we suggest regular communication between audit and scrutiny chairs. We would expect regular communication between the head of internal audit and the statutory scrutiny officer, if the authority has one, to make sure that work programmes and work are aligned. I think that scrutiny is often best placed to look at the broader policy implications of the in-year financial position, whereas audit obviously will lean slightly more towards its regulatory responsibilities. So, but identifying what the mutual roles and responsibilities of both functions are for each authority is, I think, really important. The next slide, I suppose, sets out what some of those responsibilities are and identifies some of the commonalities and some of the distinctions. I'm not going to go through this in detail now. Obviously, the slides and everything will be circulated to you afterwards, but this is just to emphasize that there are commonalities and differences between the two functions. I had some sort of discussion questions at the end. We haven't got time to go through these, but these may well be things that you may want to think about separately and reflect on your own practice about how you review finances in year, how you expect to surface and debate these kinds of issues, and how you think financial scrutiny should influence other scrutiny activity, because council finances provides the context within which everything sits at the moment. You know, it can't be ignored currently. So any scrutiny review or any consideration of any topic by scrutiny has to consider the financial implications of those issues in that service in order to be reasonable and realistic. So you'll need to develop a stronger sense of the council's financial position, of each individual service's financial position, if you're going to be able to carry out scrutiny in the round in an effective way now and in the future. So that's, I suppose, a challenge to you to address your practice in that area if it's not already done so. So we've got sort of 5 or sort of 7 minutes at the end to address any final issues that have come up. I just want to sort of firstly, before we do that, give the opportunity to Guy just to come back in at the end to reflect on what you may have heard and read subsequent to your presentation about practitioners' experiences, Guy. There you go.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, so sorry. I haven't had a chance to go through all the chat because I think I took your lead by saying that we would sort of pick that up.
Yeah, of course.
Following the meeting. I think from the so really from the group discussion, I was in with I think four other reps. I think there was a variety of structures. So in some cases, you know, scrutiny was a standalone function. In some cases, it formed part of a committee with the audit committee. So that there's clearly variation across England and between England and Wales on that. The one sort of thing that I took away from the group I was in was that some of the examples given were scrutinising the budget in January, and I think there's been other points around how you can engage scrutiny earlier within the financial planning process, because whilst whilst that might be helpful at the month before a budget is set, it seems to me quite late if that is the only opportunity that scrutiny gets to look at the council's budget setting process. So having going back to my earlier session about having a clear forward plan and a programme and how the interdependencies between the scrutiny's plan and the executive's plan is really, really important. So I do think that scrutiny needs to have an ongoing function in relation to budget setting, because it's a bit like painting the fourth bridge budget setting these days, isn't it? It's just when I started in local government 30 years ago, it sort of began after the August bank holiday and finished in February, but it's an all year round thing now. So understanding how you can contribute most appropriately through that annual cycle is going to be important.
Great. Thank you, Guy. So any final thoughts, reflections and comments from anybody really on what you've heard and seen today before we finish? You've got the opportunity to put your hand up and speak to the wider group if you want to, or put things in the chat. Robert, yes, it would be useful to hear from you. Councillor Ward is a Croydon councillor.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. It's actually a point of detail, but I've noticed that for in-year budget monitoring, it's updated every month, and what I see is that it doesn't get shared until it has to be seen by Cabinet first, and so does anybody else have this kind of a process? Because for me, once you've got a decent position on the month's position, why can't that be made more widely available? To say the Cabinet's got to see it first means that sometimes, due to the timing of meetings, that other committees are a couple of months more out of date than they need to be. And I just wonder whether anybody else had this kind of process in there.
Thank you, Robert. I think from my perspective, it's not uncommon, but I don't think that makes it right. Anybody got any reflections on that, or any other sort of comments or thoughts? As I say, feel free to put things down in the chat.
I've got another one if you like.
Yeah, no, please do.
Okay. It seems endemic, and I put it in the chat, that it's worked up within the council, you know, the budget is, and when it gets presented, it's here is the answer, there are no alternatives, there are no choices. And it's always put that everybody's terribly busy, gosh, wow, we've been working so hard, and there's and it gets presented, you know, at the last possible moment. My feeling is that that is driven by a reluctance to land yourself with work, because if somebody makes a choice, that means things might have to change. And starting early is good, but if all you do is, well, not share those options, that they're never going to be shared, then all you're doing is spinning the wheels for that first few months. If you're going to present, and that accounts for cabinet as well as scrutiny, with options, you've got to have the will to do it. And my feeling is that there's a lack of will rather than a lack of time. Again, other thoughts appreciated.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, no, I quite agree. I mean, politics is about choices, and there are always choices. And you know, arguing that there is no choice is itself a choice. You know, because those choices always exist. You may not like the other options, you may not want to take the other options, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And you know, being able to articulate and talk about those choices is fundamental, both to scrutiny and to local democracy more generally. Because, you know, if there were a single option for everything, then, you know, there wouldn't be any point in having democracy in the first place. These things are sort of fundamental. The presence and existence, the ongoing existence of these choices, even in, and particularly, in fact, in straitened and difficult financial times, are fundamental to the difficult decisions that councils have to face. It is all about the things that we prioritise and the things, therefore, that we do not prioritise. And that is why scrutiny is so important, because when these choices are made, because they are choices, they need to be subject to rigorous and effective scrutiny. Layla.
Yeah, I totally agree with Robert. So I can't put the camera on because the connection's unstable. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with Robert. It does work cross-party, because Rob and I have been usually speaking from the same hymn sheet. The other thing is something that you mentioned, Ed, which is the deliverability and the how possible it is to make certain things happen. We told at senior level that, you know, every single layers of the organizations have been involved in defining what the budget should be, or what, you know, where the savings could be happening, etc., etc. But then when you speak with heads of service, they will tell you, we're not on board with this, we don't think it's deliverable. And usually they're the ones who write, because the new financial year starts, and within Q2 you start to see where those targets are not being met, and usually those heads of service had it right all along. And so I do believe that the culture needs to change and be a lot more bottom up in terms of developing budgets and greater accountability at all layers of the organization. And not, you know, it's not that only the senior people can be trusted, otherwise I don't think it'll ever be effective.
Thanks, Layla. That's a really, really important point, and it provides me with an opportunity to kind of conclude things as well, because we're out of time. But Guy mentioned in passing the difference between incremental and zero-based budgeting, and I think this is where some of that comes in, because when you zero-based budget, when you basically start afresh every single year and you know, don't just carry over assumptions about what's needed, that has to be based on in my experience anyway, a bottom-up understanding about what local need is, where local pressures are and where local priorities demand that money be spent in order to meet local needs. And that should be governed to a greater or lesser extent by the understanding of frontline officers about what they do, how they do it, the impact that work has, and then using that experience and insight to build the budget at a more senior level. If you do zero-based budgeting that kind of starts with CMT sitting down in a room together and saying, how are we going to allocate things across departments, then that isn't really zero-based budgeting. It's more about understanding need and then allocating resources according to need. So that's the argument I would make about that. So I think that highlights why that incremental model of budgeting, which is often inherently top down, is less and less able to cope with the difficulties that we find ourselves in now, because it makes assumptions about locking in spending in certain areas in certain ways, which may not be appropriate year on year. The difficulty, of course, of that is that many programs and projects on which the council is engaged may well be multi-year in nature, and it may be difficult to determine in year or on the basis of only a year's working the impact that certain spend might have, and there may be disagreements about the impact of certain spend and the relative priority that certain spend should have in consequence. But of course, that provides the opportunity for scrutiny to come in, because it's about prioritisation, it's about choices, and that's about local politics and the judgments that local politicians can and should be making about what gets spent and what doesn't get spent. So it's this kind of conversation about the fundamentals of zero-based budgeting, what we do and don't spend things on, is fundamental to scrutiny and fundamental to local democratic debate. So we are out of time, I regret, and I'm sorry about that, because I think it's been it's felt like a really useful and productive session. I hope that you found it to be so as well. As we said, Meg is going to be producing a note which will be going online, summarising some of the issues here. We will make sure that if there are outstanding questions that we have not addressed, I will try and make sure that note weaves in answers to some of those questions where at all possible. And of course, the recording, I hope, will be made available to you as well. Well, obviously it will not include the small group sessions, it will just include the plenary stuff. So thank you. If we can be of any assistance on matters relating to budget and finance scrutiny, then please do get in touch with us directly. You can contact info@cfgs.org.uk. You can contact me directly by phone or by email as well. And I'd be really, really keen to hear your experiences in more general, actually, even if you haven't got a specific question, just letting us know what you're doing and how you're doing it on budget and finance scrutiny is incredibly useful to us in understanding how we can support that work going forward. So thank you again to all of you. Thank you particularly for Guy. Really, really useful and valuable contribution from him. And I hope that you all have a pleasant remainder of your afternoons.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.